Good morning.
Good morning.
Glad you could all be out here this morning. As you can tell from the scripture reading, I'm going to be talking about the tongue. And this sermon is as much for me as it is for you, because I have a problem with my tongue also. So James devotes most of chapter 3 to our challenge of controlling the tongue. In this sermon this morning, we're going to examine James' pronouncements about the tongue, and then look at improper and proper uses of the tongue. If your tongue has ever gotten you into trouble, please raise your hand. Now turn to your partner and say, "I'm not surprised." Why are we not surprised? Because it happens to all of us. All of us have had the experience of saying something and then wishing we had not said it. I heard the story of a man who worked at a produce department of a grocery store. A woman came up and asked if she could buy half a head of lettuce. It had been one of those days, and before he could think, he replied, "Half a head? Are you serious? God grows these things in whole heads, but I can go and check with the manager if you'd like." So he went to the manager. He marched away, and he said to the manager, "You won't believe this, but there's a lame-brained idiot of a lady back there who wants to know if she can buy a half a head of lettuce." As he was saying that, he noticed that the manager was trying to subtly stop him from his outburst. The crazed employee turned around to see the lady standing behind him. Unbeknownst to him, she had followed him in search of the manager. But without skipping a beat, the employee said to the manager, "And this nice lady was wondering if she could buy the other half of the head of lettuce." Later in the day, the manager cornered the young man and said, "That was the finest example of thinking on your feet I've ever seen. Where did you learn that skill?" The man replied, "Well, I grew up in Grand Rapids, and if you know anything about Grand Rapids, you know that it's known for its great hockey teams and its ugly women." The manager interrupted him. "Hey, my wife's from Grand Rapids." The employee quickly asked, "And which hockey team did she play for?" Oh, how our tongue can get us into a bunch of jams and in trouble. If my mother said it once, she said it 1,000 times to me. "Son, think before you speak." Every day, you and I speak thousands of words. That's a lot of opportunities for us to say something wrong. And you know that I'm right about that, because we all say something wrong. As we look at chapter 3 of James, we notice that he devotes most of this chapter to the tongue and its implications for us as Christians. As we can see here, James intended to help us see the implications that our faith should have on our lives. Now we have to know this important truth, that a faith that saves is more than just something you say, feel, or think. Rather, it's something you do. As we learn to do our faith, we learn to show that our faith should impact the way that we endure our trials and the way we overcome our temptations. In his book, he points out that because of our faith, we should have a handle on our anger. And I think that's mainly the biggest problem with us, is when we get angry, we say things that we shouldn't say. And we should be very careful with that. Rather, it should be some things that we do. Our faith has to be our actions, is what it has to be. James' book summarizes that what God expects from us saying in chapter 1, verse 27, that pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their trouble, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. Now here in chapter 3, we notice that James returns to the subject of the tongue. Back in chapter 1, he introduced the topic in 2 verses. In 1:19, and that it reads, "So then, my beloved brother, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath." And 1:26 reads, "If anyone among you thinks he is religious, and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless." Pretty serious talk there. Everyone in this room, I think, is religious. That's why you're here this morning, to worship God. But sometimes we turn our religion into something useless because of the way we act or react to the things in life. James wants us to understand just how destructive and nullifying the tongue can be. The negative influence of the tongue can override an otherwise godly life if we're not careful. So let us see what points James makes in the chapter about the tongue, and then let's work on some practical steps for taming that tongue this morning. James' pronouncement about the tongue. James makes 3 pronouncements about the tongue here in chapter 3. First, James says that the tongue is small but powerful. In 3 through 5, he tells us that I'm just going to paraphrase here, that we put a bridle into the mouth of a horse to control it. Ships are controlled by a rudder, a small rudder. I mean, some of us here may have went on a cruise, and those ships are gigantic, but yet the rudder controls those ships. First, James reminds us of the fact that very large horses are controlled by a very small bit. Horses are incredibly powerful, and many of them weigh about 2,000 pounds. Yet even a small child can control the direction of that horse by placing the bit in its mouth. The secret of the bit is the fact that it's placed in one of the horse's most sensitive places. Have you ever had a small child kind of stick their finger in your mouth and kind of yank on your cheek? Well, that's what the horse is feeling when you're trying to direct him in that direction. When I was a kid, I had a gentleman move in down the road from me, bought a big farmhouse, and it had a corral on the one side you could ride a horse around. It was probably almost a mile track. But his daughter was quite spoiled, and she got just about everything she wanted. Well, she wanted a horse, but then when she got the horse, she wouldn't take care of it. So he paid me to take care of the horse. So I would go down every morning and I'd feed it, and I would brush it, and I'd go down every evening and I'd feed it, and sometimes I'd brush it then too. But the one perk I had was, you saddle that horse and you take it across the street to that corral and you ride it, okay? So I rode the living daylights out of that horse. So I got a lot of benefit out of that horse, and I know what it's all about as far as controlling a horse with the bridle. The second picture that he paints is the ship, and as I mentioned, they're gigantic, they're thousands of tons, but yet compared to the rudder, it's a very small thing that is controlling that ship. And then he wants to let us know that one tiny spark can burn down a whole forest. And I get a real kick out of that commercial they put on TV about the chain. Talking about the chain dragging behind the truck. You think he's talking about something else, and all of a sudden it turns to somebody towing a trailer and they got a chain and it's sparking on the road. Well, if the leaves are dry enough, it could do a lot of damage. They may start by one careless cigarette toss out the window of a passing car or a chain dragging on the road, as I mentioned. Remember, it only takes a spark to get a fire going. So what is James' point here? The tongue is only a small part of the body, but it can cause big trouble. Pound for pound, the tongue is very small, but it is oh so powerful. Secondly, James says that the tongue is uncontrollably dangerous. And he compares it to a fire, to a spark. He compares it to man himself taming almost every animal that's even in existence. They've been able to tame them. And that's how powerful the tongue is. For this point, James again points to the illustration of fire. It only takes a small spark to start a fire. But once a fire gets started, it's most impossible to stop. It is uncontrolled. Between the years of 2007 and 2017, wildfires in the United States burned 6.2 million acres a year in those 10 years. Fire is hard to control. Next, James mentions the fact that we have tamed many kinds of animals, which I mentioned. The third pronouncement that James makes about the tongue is terribly inconsistent. In James 3:9 through 10, with it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men, who we have made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceeds blessings and cursings. My brethren, these things ought not to be. How tragic is it that we can use our tongue to praise God in worship, as we're doing this morning, and then 10 minutes later, if we have children, we're out and screaming at them in the back seat of the car. Did that many times. It can also be used to criticize. It can be used for gossiping. And that's where you get in trouble. Our tongues are terribly inconsistent, but James declared, my brethren and sisters, these things ought not be. Then he asked a couple of rhetorical questions in James 3:11 through 12. And he's talking about a spring. And when me and Mary bought our property in Pennsylvania, down at the bottom of the hill, there was a natural spring that was coming out of the bank. And the water was good. And it stayed good. And when me and my little sister would ride our bikes, there was a spring that we used to stop at and get water also. It was called Silver Springs. That's what it was called in New Brighton, Pennsylvania. The thing we have to think about here is the tongue is a very small item, but it's a very powerful thing. The tongue is uncontrollably dangerous, and the tongue is terribly inconsistent. Should we give up and just say, well, that's just me? That's the way a lot of people do, right? They just give up. But we can't do that. God has a plan for us to tame the tongue. We could spend a lot of time in this lesson dwelling on all the bad things we have said and how we had hurt others with our words, but that would be unprofitable. So let's spend the final few minutes of this sermon thinking about the proper and improper ways that the tongue is used. First, Paul taught in Ephesians 4:29, let no corrupt words proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearer. That it may impart grace to the hearer. And that's what we should be doing to people. We should be building them up instead of tearing them down. So what kind of things should we avoid? First, we should avoid profanity and vulgar speech. This is one area where we can really stand out in contrast with the world around us. What's the first thing you hear in the world when somebody hits their thumb with a hammer or something like that, it's usually something profane. I like what Peanuts, the cartoonist, Charles Schulz, said on this point. And it was, I have a strong dislike for vulgar phrases and find that terms like good grief and rats will cover virtually anything that happens. And I've often wondered myself, I've even asked myself this question. I don't talk to myself very often because you guys would really think odd of me, but I have asked myself, why do we have to react every time something happens? Every time something happens, we have to react some way, somehow. And I think we should avoid complaining and arguing. Right, Mary? And that's one thing that God detests too. We as Christians should be thinking about what we're saying and doing something about what we are saying. We should avoid gossip and slander, and we should avoid complaining and arguing, as I mentioned. God wants us to think about what we're doing in our lives, is what He wants us to do. Fourth, we can use our tongue to bless our relationships. We can learn how and when to say some of the most important short sentences like, I love you, thank you, I am sorry, please forgive me, how can I help, could you help me with this? We should avoid negative speech that criticizes and tears people down. You might be thinking, okay, Doug, I know the wrong and right use of the tongue, but the problem is I can't control my tongue. Can you give me some help about how to control my tongue? Well, here are a few things that I find helpful. First, we have to ask God for help. We're not going to be able to do it on our own. God even tells us that. Second, God is the only one that can help us, as I mentioned. So throughout the day, pray for the ability to control the tongue. Second, and this is one of my biggest problems, I open my mouth too quick is what I do. You need to think before you speak. Be slow to speak. We need to delay our response even for a few seconds. This will give us a few seconds to weigh our words and consider their impact on the people around us. That goes back to the statement that I told you about my mother saying that think before you speak. If we take the word think and break it down into letters, the T is for truth. We should always be speaking the truth. H is your speech should always be helpful to others. I, it should be inspiring. N, only do it if it's necessary. And K is it's kind. I read about one person who was not allowed to talk for 6 months, and so all their communications had to be written down on paper. The person reported that so much was left uncommunicated because the process of having to put it on paper caused them to see how unimportant or hurtful some of it was. Solomon says in Proverbs 10:19, in the multitude of words, sin is not lacking. But he who restrains his lips is wise. In other words, he who holds his tongue is wise. Someone said there is nothing wrong with having nothing to say unless you say it. And the old saying is true. Keep your words as sweet as possible because you may have to eat them. Third, having heart surgery may be necessary, and Jesus can do that heart surgery. Jesus taught in Matthew 12:34, "Brood of vipers, how can you, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks." And Matthew 15:19, "For out of the heart proceeds evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornication, theft, false witness, and blasphemy." If you don't want awful stuff coming out of your mouth, then we need God's help to get awful stuff out of our hearts, or not put them there in the first place. Finally, remember, we will meet our words in judgment. Matthew 12:36-37. "But I say to you that for every idle word men may speak, they will give an account of it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned." That kind of warning should be enough to cause us to pause and think about our words before we say them. Don't you think? As we bring this sermon to a close, I'm so thankful for God's grace when I fail to use my tongue properly. And I'm so thankful for God's assistance and the power to tame my tongue. Perhaps this sermon has caused you to realize that you're using your tongue in the wrong way. Not using it in a positive way, but in a negative way. But here's some things that we can do also. We need to pray to God for help, as I mentioned. And if you need to come back this morning, you could have that opportunity also to make a confession and ask for forgiveness. Or, if you need to express thanksgiving to the Lord for yourself, for salvation, and become a Christian, we could arrange for your baptism this morning also. Please come as we stand and sing.